So we're here on the North River at the Minto Trap Facility, and the fish are spawning naturally in the river behind me. However, we're pulling a lot of fish out of the river and using them in the spawning for the spring Chinook salmon to release the juveniles in a year, so they'll hopefully go to the ocean and come back. Now, those salmon that are left from the spawning process have a lot of valuable nutrients in them. And when the fish spawn naturally and die, their bodies decompose and they feed the whole ecology of the stream. They feed the aquatic insects. And those aquatic insects, those little bugs, then provide food for the young salmon when they hatch out. There's young salmon now in the river from last year, and those fish will actually eat the bodies of the salmon as they decompose. But because we have a lot less salmon returning to the river than we used to historically, and because we pull these fish out of the river to spawn them, now we go back and we put these salmon into the river. We throw the carcasses into the river. I am the Salmon Trout Enhancement Program Biologist for the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. My name is Karen Hans. I work out of the Corvallis office. I'm here with some volunteers today, and we have loaded up a couple hundred of these salmon, and we're going to take them up the river a ways and stop periodically along the road and throw a couple of dozen or so into the river as we go. This will hopefully mimic the natural process where the fish are distributed out through the river amongst their spawning grounds. These salmon will provide this valuable nutrients to the fish that are there now and to the next generation when they hatch out. But there's a lot of other animals that benefit from these salmon as well. The bears, the cougars, the eagles, the hawks, the otters, the raccoons, the skunks, the bobcats, they all come and feed on these salmon right before the winter when they don't have a lot of food. So the salmon provide a very valuable resource for these animals as well. In addition, when the bear comes along and drags the salmon's body up onto the bank, that fish decomposes and fertilizes the soil, and it provides valuable nutrients for the trees. So that's why we call the salmon a keystone species in the ecology of the Pacific Northwest, and why it's important for us to try to get as many of these salmon back into the river where the nutrients in their bodies can provide food for these animals both in and out of the water. Now, sometimes people ask me about how there's a rule that says they can't put their fish or their fish guts into the river after they clean their fish. And yet here I am throwing all these salmon in the creek. And so I'd like to address that question. A lot of the reason that we have that rule, the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife has that rule, is for diseases. Certain watershed may have a disease like bacterial kidney disease, for example, and the fish in that watershed are infected, but they're not in a different river. And so these fish that came from the North River will only be put in the North River. We don't move them over to the coast, or we don't bring coastal fish over here. And so that way we don't move diseases around with these fish. What's that? Oh, really? Okay. All right. Thank you. So we've cut the tails off these fish because we're pitching them out into the river where there's naturally spawning salmon, and there's surveyors that work for Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife that count the number of naturally spawning fish in the river. We don't want them to confuse these fish coming from the hatchery with those naturally spawning fish. So we cut the tails off before we throw them out into the river. So,
okay, we've got a couple tubs of salmon here that have been spawned out, and these are ready for putting back in the river, which they call the fish toss.
over time, the carcasses will start to float as they decompose, and they'll move down the river and distribute out. And then they'll settle behind a rock or in a log jam somewhere and start to break down, and then the little fishes will come along and start to nibble on them and break them down further, and eventually it'll go all the way down to its very most basic elements of carbon, nitrogen, and all the minerals, and that will fuel the very lowest level of the ecosystem. There's also what we call marine-derived nutrients, or marine-derived isotopes they're also called, and they're chemicals that are only found in the ocean, and yet we find them here, even in the tissue of the fish, the freshwater fish, in the animals, in the bark of the trees. And we know that the only way that those marine-derived nutrients get here is from the salmon. So rather than just pulling up to a bridge somewhere and dumping all 200 fish at one location, we stop periodically along the road where it's safe to work, and we throw in a few fish at a time, usually 25 to 30. And in that way we try to mimic the natural spawning and distribution of the fish. getting everything cleaned up here. I just can't say enough about my volunteers and how much they help me. This is Joanne and Dennis. And volunteers are really at the heart of my program, the Salmon Trout Enhancement Program. I could not do my job without them. And they're just great folks and good-hearted people that want to do the right thing to help the fish. And you can see they're out here in the rain, and they're doing this dirty job here, getting covered with salmon slime and blood, and they're just great folks, and I just can't say enough how much I appreciate all the work they do for me. I put out a call this year for volunteers to help me here on the North Sandy Am, and I had a huge response. More people than I could use. And just a lot of real wonderful people out there that want to help the resource and help the fish, and that's what my program does. It matches up volunteers with ODFW to do the kind of work we